Welcome back to our Road to Emmaus Bible journey. We're picking up in Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians here in Second Thessalonians, and I will be talking about chapter 1 today. Now, the book itself was Paul having to revisit a few things going on in the Thessalonian church. They were dealing with persecution and afflictions and false teaching that worked its way in that was causing a lot of the church members to panic. Some of them were quitting their jobs even because they had this false understanding that Jesus was coming back. And in an unhealthy way, they were giving up all of the normal routines of life, and it was actually causing a disturbance in the body. But one of the themes that you'll find throughout all three chapters of this second letter from Paul is this idea of standing firm in your faith. So as we look at chapter 1, he starts with thanksgiving to God for this church. And he basically says some really healthy things appear to be happening in the church. He says your faith is growing abundantly and your love for one another is increasing. So by any measure of a healthy church, Paul's looking at them and saying, you're getting it right, you're doing well. If you think back to what Jesus said, he's like, the law and the prophets all depend on two things. Love God the Father with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So they were doing that. And Paul even goes further to say, I boast about you in the other churches. And one thing we have to be careful with is when we read verse 4 in this chapter, sometimes we get away thinking, well, Paul's rejoicing in their suffering. It's not the suffering that he's excited about. That would be cruel. What he's really excited about is their endurance, their steadfastness in the suffering. It's just like when Jesus was talking to Peter and he said, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed that your faith would not fail. So Paul's position is not, I'm happy that you're suffering. It's, I rejoice in the fact that your faith is proving strong under trial. Now, as you get to the middle of the chapter, there's a lot of discussion about the judgment of God that's coming down on the wicked. Ultimately, what Paul is saying there is the longer that the wicked persecute the righteous and bring afflictions against the righteous and troubles to the church, they're stacking up evidence against themselves for the day of judgment. So we don't need to be fearful. We don't need to panic. God's got us and he's watching. As you think about what's happening in our country, you're looking at other states where certain governors may be overreaching in their authority, telling the church what we can and can't do. Even here in our community, there's a little bit of confusion about when our kids can go back to school, work impacts, and a number of different things. When we take a look at this passage, whether it feels like it's an affliction or a persecution or whatever's happening with COVID, Paul is saying stand firm in your faith. You don't have to panic. There's a difference between having the urgency of the Spirit of God that leads you to prayer and studying the Word versus being in an all-out panic. And so he gives us a couple things that I'll read from verses 11 and 12 that I think just help us understand the difference in actions that you take when it's faith versus fear. In verse 11, he says, to this end, we always pray for you that our God may make you worthy of his calling and may fulfill every resolve for good and every work of faith by his power. The beginning of verse 12 says, so that the name of our Lord Jesus Christ may be glorified in you. So the two things he says in there are basically set your mind to do good, and then every action you take, do it out of faith. And the Spirit of God comes behind you and empowers your good works and empowers your faith so that you have the ability to stand. And bonus, the goal is not that you ran away from what felt like persecution or that you had to worry about trying to strong arm your faith. The Spirit of God helps you to fulfill it, and then Christ is glorified in you. So I'll say to you, just as Paul would say, be encouraged, stand firm in your faith, and do not fear. Until next time, God bless.